Welcome back, and welcome back to everyone on the live stream. So we heard a lot today about what happened, and now we want to talk a little bit about what happens next. And so one of the things we have thought about as this whole thing has been designed and implemented is that really this predictive modeling stage is a beginning and not an end. And so now we want to talk about some of the stuff that's going to come next, because we've heard a lot of really interesting ideas. And we're just going to summarize some of the stuff we're thinking about. And just as during the challenge, some of the most interesting and unexpected stuff came from the broader community. We're expecting that to happen again as well in terms of the next steps. So I started off by saying thank you, and we definitely want to start off this session also by saying thank you. This was a really wonderful 2 days for me. All I can say is when we started this, I had no idea about all the cool stuff that was going to happen. And so I'm really, personally, really grateful for all of the stuff that happened and all the contributions that you made to this bigger project.
So I'd just like to echo that and thank you all for coming and giving your time and energy and ideas to the group. I learned a huge amount in these last 2 days. As you can see from my talk this morning, the Fragile Families, we've had a history of incorporating new people and new ideas and new topics to the data. And this is, to me, one of the most enjoyable parts about my life, about being an academic. I get to do this. I get to keep learning. And this is sort of probably the biggest leap we've done, but I think it has the potential to be enormous as well. If you think about most of the other projects and modules we've added, they were social scientists with sort of different ideas. I feel like we now have the potential to bring in a whole new group of data analysts to the data. And I think that could just have an enormous effect on what we're going to learn about the things we care about. So thank you all.
Okay, so let me tell you a little bit about what we have planned. And at the beginning, we talked about some possible themes, and we did, in fact, hear a lot about these, both in the talks and during the coffee breaks and during the lunch. So it was great to see that these kinds of issues got addressed. Obviously, we did not answer any of these questions, nor did we expect to answer them. But I hope that this will encourage further discussions, further reflections, and further research on these themes and many more. I want to talk a little bit now about how we're going to use the submissions to do cool stuff. So as we saw, these were the best individual performing models. And so these are far from perfect. And so one of the big questions is why? What is going on here? And so one possibility is that there's a lot of important and unmeasured stuff out there. So this idea that there's this potentially like dark matter, stuff that is out there that we are not currently measuring. And so Sara and her colleagues have spent many years thinking about what should be measured and how it should be measured. But it's possible there are other things that are not currently being measured that are important. Or it's possible that there are new ways of combining the things that are being measured that would help make the predictive performance improve. And so one of the things that we want to do is use the predictive models to target people for in-depth interviews. So we've heard a lot about machine learning, and one of my favorite questions to machine learning researchers is, what's the best method you have for finding important variables that are not in your data set? And they're like, oh, we don't have a method for finding important variables not in our data set. And I say, guess what? Sociologists have a method for that. It's called interviewing people. And they're like, oh, that's interesting. That's exciting. So the idea is that if we want to look for these unmeasured things, though, that are big and important, it helps us to find the people who have the most of this dark matter. And so the people who are most poorly predicted by these models, by all of the best models that we have available, those are the people that are potentially high in this other stuff. And so we think by going and talking to those people, we are most likely to discover these unmeasured things. So if you think about how interviews are normally conducted, the sampling is maybe ad hoc or random. We think by doing this targeted sampling, we're more likely to discover new things. Also, figuring out these unmeasured things is very important for causal inference. And so if you think about a model where many of you predicted things like grade point average, and there were some things that were predictive of grade point average, and there's some unmeasured stuff U that is also predictive of grade point average. We don't know what that stuff is. But grade point average and also eviction is an outcome in the challenge, but it's also potentially a treatment for something that comes later. So we might want to study the effect of eviction on earnings at age 15. And so in this case, it's very important to understand whether the unmeasured outcomes affect the unmeasured things, the dark matter, affects just eviction, or whether it affects eviction and earnings. And so if we are in this situation, we have a big problem for causal inference. If we are in this situation, we have some hope in a causal inference strategy. And so a lot of times in causal inference, there's a lot of debate about, or sort of debate about whether this selection on observables is appropriate. And we think it depends a lot on what the unobserved things are and their actual relationship to the outcomes. And so we think the best way to figure that out is to go and find out what these unobserved things are rather than sit around talking about them. Let's go find them. So that also then, you can imagine these interviews fitting in part of a bigger cycle. So we start with systematic longitudinal data collection. Then you have a predictive modeling phase. Then we do in-depth interviews. Then those interviews improve future waves of systematic data collection. And you can imagine this whole cycle being repeated over and over. And so we know that the Fragile Families study is a great study, and there are many other great longitudinal studies as well that would potentially benefit from having this predictive modeling stage, doing these in-depth interviews, and then continuing this process. And we think this could become a routine thing in all longitudinal studies. So this is to come. We're going to have to try to figure out how to do this. Also, in terms of output into the scientific literature, so everyone can learn from the great talks here and everything that's happened. So we're going to have one community paper that will be co-authored by everyone who made important contributions to the challenge. And then that will also include a release of all of the code and all of the predictions. And we think that those artifacts themselves may be some of the most valuable things that come out of the challenge. We also have this special issue of the journal Socius, which is a new journal published by the American Sociological Association. It's a completely open access journal. So there were 14 manuscripts that were submitted by participants. We are going to ensure that all of these papers are fully reproducible. David Liu, who was here earlier, has been emailing with many of the contributors, getting your code, making sure it runs, and we're going to put those into Docker containers with all the appropriate dependencies to make sure that they really are easy to reproduce. Also, the entire Socius journal is fully open access, so the papers will be available to everyone. Also, the data set and the benchmarks can be very useful for future teaching and future research. So we already have some, we heard about many students who participated in the challenge. In some ways that was exciting, in some ways that was frustrating. We also have now other professors who are interested in using the challenge as a project in their class. And at this point, they can potentially learn much more about the context around the challenge, and they could potentially even read the paper or the papers in the special issue to learn about how other people approach the problem, either before or after they do this project in their class. Also, I think this creates a really exciting benchmark for people. So there are some people who have new approaches to missing data, new approaches to modeling, and I think if they can do better than what happened in this first round, I think that will be wonderful. And we hope that this provides an exciting benchmark that people will want to beat, and that we'll learn a lot in that process of people working towards this benchmarks. So we've already made a lot of progress in making the Fragile Families data easier to use, and that is all due to the suffering that you all went through. So we know that there was a lot of suffering, and we are trying to minimize that suffering on future people. And so willingness to do that suffering and your willingness to share with us both what you found difficult and also how you actually tried to solve these problems, that's enabled us to do better and make it easier for other researchers in the future, whether it will be in a challenge setting or it will be the people who are using the Fragile Families data in the ways that have been done in the past. So there have been hundreds of papers using the Fragile Families data before the challenge, and that community still exists, and they will be able to benefit from everything that's happened here as well. We also want to make it easier for other people to do challenges. So for other data holders, if you would like to organize a challenge, it was hard. it was time consuming, but we really wanted to write down sort of all the stuff that we did so that other people won't have to deal with the same problems that we dealt with. And so we have a paper that about the privacy audit that we went through and the procedures that we used to screen participants and how we sort of dealt with the complex challenges of making the data available to a wider community while protecting and respecting the participants in the data. So we have a paper about that that's under review. We also have a paper about our process of rebuilding the metadata. So we summarize many of the concerns and problems that you ran into and describe our approaches to addressing them. And we hope that this will be really helpful for other people that have complex survey data so that they can learn from the challenges that you ran into. And then there's lots and lots of little logistical things. Every little thing that you saw on the blog, like we had a lot of conversations about. There's a lot of thinking that went into lots of aspects of the design, and all of that stuff is still up on the blog. So if other people want to see how we tried to explain it, if other people want to see how we did the Getting Started workshops, all of this stuff is available for other people to use and improve. So I think, though, one of the most exciting things that we've produced is actually lots of new questions. So over and over, we heard about things that we would have liked to have done if we had more time, questions that could be addressed in future research. And so in some ways, the greatest outcome is all of these new questions that we are going to work on, individually, in teams, and collectively going forward. So if you want to stay connected, so one way is you can subscribe to the Fragile Families Challenge blog. If you put your email address in there, you'll get updates from us every time we make a new blog post. You can also follow the Fragile Families Study on Twitter. And I think the best way to stay connected is to continue your research. So one of the things that I found most heartening about the Fragile Families community is that it's really like a family. It should be called the Fragile Families family. They all know each other. They stay connected. It's a really amazing, warm, welcoming community. And so now that you have participated in the challenge, you are also a part of the Fragile Families family. And you will be welcome at all family events. And seriously, they would be really excited. We would be really excited to the extent that you want to stay involved in that community. That would be wonderful. So we started off by thinking about sort of what we could all accomplish together that none of us could accomplish individually. And it seems like we've got to start, but we have lots more to do. So thank you all for coming, and I hope you all will stay a part of the family. Thank you.